All right, so we're going to start a new series, as Father Samson wrote last week in the bulletin. And we're going to spend, including today, the next 6 Sundays talking about sacraments. So where I'd like to begin, we're going to talk about baptism today as a basic, but I want to begin with a pop quiz. Okay? How many sacraments are there in the church? Who wants to raise their hand and give me the answer? Who wants to raise their hand and give me the answer? Georgia.
Is it 7?
No, its answer is not 7. Who would like to try again? Who said 8? Didn't I say raise your hand and try? Okay, you said 8. 8 is wrong. It's not 8. Wonder, if I had my telephone, maybe somebody watching back home would be able to tell us how many. 10? No. 11? No. 9? No. There's one sacrament. Who knows what it is? No? Communion. Here's the thing, and this is where we'll start about sacraments. Prior to Martin Luther's Reformation, the church never had any number listed on their sacraments. Life revolves around Holy Communion. The only true sacrament of the church is Holy Communion. Okay? And the word sacrament comes from the Latin to make holy. The Greek word for sacrament, who knows the Greek word for sacrament? Raise your hand. Mysterion, mystery. And that's because in the sacraments, God somehow changes us, but we don't know how He does it. It's a mystery. But the only true sacrament is Holy Communion. But the Lutherans were causing a trouble in the West because they were arguing with the Roman Catholic Church. And the Roman Church had 7 sacraments: baptism, confirmation, Holy Communion, Holy Unction, marriage, ordination, and confession. And so the Lutherans said to the Orthodox, well, how many sacraments do you have? And the Patriarch said, what are you talking about? How many sacraments? There's the Eucharist. Our entire life is a sacrament because our entire life is to be in communion with God. Well, how many do you have? He says, what did Rome say? Rome said 7. Okay, we'll use the same 7. And that's how we actually got trapped by Martin Luther in terms of identifying the 7 sacraments. And the reason the church used that 7, and we still talk about the 7 sacraments today, although I'll explain why it's different, is because in the ancient church, every one of those 7 sacraments was actually in the liturgy. Baptism was in the liturgy. Marriage was in the liturgy. Chrismation was in the liturgy. Confession was in the liturgy. There's only, besides Holy Communion itself, there's only one sacrament that is still done in the liturgy. Does anybody know what it is? Raise your hands. We just did it last week. We did it in Tampa. Ordination. Ordination is currently the only sacrament that is still done in the context of divine liturgy. And so because all those 7 services were part of the liturgy and therefore had Holy Communion, the church said, okay, those are the 7 sacraments. However, everything we do is a sacrament of the church. Because a sacrament, if a sacrament is how and the services we do and the things we do that make us holy, well, then the ayusmo service is a sacrament. The funeral is a sacrament. The house blessings is a sacrament. The paraklesis is a sacrament. Feeding the poor is a sacrament. Because we are living our Christian life in communion with God. And so everything that we do as faithful Orthodox Christians in communion with God, everything we do now we call sacramental. Okay? Baptism is a unique thing, which is why we're starting with it today. Because baptism is actually an initiation into the church. Because baptism by itself, nobody receives Holy Communion. You have to have Chrismation and baptism to receive Holy Communion. And of course, in today's practice, we do the two of them together. It's actually two mysteries, two sacraments in one service. So today we're going to talk about baptism, our initiation into the church. When do you think the baptism service actually begins? Chronologically, think about life, think about things on our calendar as we are alive. When do the prayers for baptism begin? When we're born. In fact, the baptism is referenced on the very first day that the priest goes to the hospital. The baptism is referenced on the 8-day blessing of the baby, and the baptism is referenced at the 40-day blessing of the baby. All of that because all of those prayers are to prepare us to enter into the church. And so baptism is a unique thing because it is actually outside the church. It's what makes us members of the church. Baptism is what actually joins us to Christ in our baptism. And that's why we sing, all those who have been baptized have put on Christ, right? And so we actually are joined to Christ in our baptism. The other thing that you can notice about sacraments in general is the first words of a sacrament. When we talk about one of the seven, anything that in the ancient church used to have Holy Communion, or still does, like liturgy and baptisms and things, the service begins, Evloimeni Vasilia, blessed is the kingdom. But Vespers, Orthros, Paraklesis, the Ayosmos service, did I say Orthros already? Orthros starts Evloitos o Theos, blessed is our God. And so if you're wondering what service you're attending, is it a sacrament, is it not a sacrament, you can listen to the words, but you have to be on time to hear those words. Those are the very first words. So I'm not sure John would ever actually hear those words to the church. You picked the fight today, John. You picked the fight today. So, Evloimeni Vasilia, blessed is the kingdom, is the very first prayer of every sacrament. I think Father Sampson wrote that also today in the bulletin. So, how many of you remember your baptism? Anybody? No. Stavrula, you don't remember your baptism? And why is it that we don't remember our baptism? We were all there, weren't we? We were all there. Why is it we don't remember our baptism? Well, because we were babies. So there's something about our tradition that is also very beautiful, and that is that we baptize babies. It's also something that we have to defend with the Protestant church. Because the Protestant church, some of the Protestant church, not all of them, don't think we should baptize babies. And I discussed that, if you remember, in a sermon this summer when we talked about baptism. Baptism is initiation into the life of the church. and it presumes that we're going to be living the church. And that's why we are okay with baptizing babies, because the parents are coming to church, and the godparents are coming to church, and the baby is coming to church and is living that life in communion with God. And so we do baptize, we could say, on the faith of the parents. And I have many sessions with parents who say, I want to baptize my baby, but they don't go to church. Or worse, they want to baptize their baby, but they go to a Baptist church, or they go to a evangelical church, but they happen to be Greek and they want to baptize their baby. And I said, that makes no sense. Why would you baptize your baby in the church that you don't attend? Go to the church you attend and baptize the baby. That's making sense of the service. But those churches don't baptize babies. So, yes? Okay, that's a good question. So isn't the baptism so Christ will protect the children? God will protect the children no matter what. We do not, now when I say we, I mean the church, we do not believe that an unbaptized baby has some kind of extra danger of going to hell if something happens. We don't believe that God does that to babies. In fact, if an unbaptized baby dies, there's a special funeral just for unbaptized babies. There is a special funeral. It's not the regular funeral, but there is a special funeral for unbaptized babies. The difference is that we say, because baptism is the initiation into the church, it's not some kind of hocus pocus that the priest does simply to protect the baby. St. Paul warns us of this in the book of Romans. St. Paul warns us that if we are baptized and then do not follow through with life in Christ, it is more dangerous for our soul to be baptized and never come to church. And so I remind parents, they're more at risk in their own lives to pretend and bring their children for baptism, having no intention of ever coming to church. That's actually worse for the baby than not baptizing the baby. We are comforted in God's mercy and protection and grace over the baby. Now, in the older generation, life was looked at a little differently. We have special services for baptisms in hospitals and things like that if a baby is not going to survive. But that's because we have an understanding that the family is already faithful. So it wouldn't make sense to just go randomly through the hospital baptizing babies. But because the family is faithful, if the baby can't get to the church, we do the baptism in the hospital. But it's because they can't get to the church. Okay, so we have to understand how we think of those things. It's not that the baby is at danger, but as a faithful family, we want all of our family to be united to Christ. And so if the family, because the baby is deathly ill, cannot leave the hospital, the incubators and things, we've all, some people have even done them themselves. Even lay people can do that if the priest cannot get there in time. There's a very special thing to do in the church. But those are the extreme examples. We're talking now the normal everyday pattern is our children, and we bring our children to the church on the 8th day and the 40th day, and then we look to schedule the baptism.
Question.
Yes.
When you baptize a child in the hospital because you think they're not going to survive, what do you do? Do they have to do anything? My brother was one of those.
Yeah, that's a beautiful story. So if the baby is baptized in the hospital and then survives, we only do the Chrismation. The baptism is, we believe in one baptism. And so it even says in the service book, I don't have it with me, but it even says, if the baby was born in the hospital, begin here. and we begin with just the Chrismation service because the actual baptism already took place? Yeah. Great question. Great question. Where was I? I was about to say something. That's okay. I'd rather answer questions. So since I can't remember where I was, ask me a question. Yeah, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, yes. And anyone can do that. Nurses, yayas, papus, if the priest can't come, and it's still a real baptism. But again, that's because you're there, and you're in Nunai, and you would have come to church otherwise. But he wasn't able to come. So that's a beautiful story. Thank you. I was going to say, yes.
Some of the Protestants have asked me why we baptize babies, because they feel you need a realization of who Christ is to be actually baptized. Christ was baptized himself as an adult, not as a baby. So why do we do it as babies versus a Catholic sacrament?
Well, now Catholics do baptize babies, Methodists baptize babies, Lutherans baptize babies, Presbyterians do as well. Okay, mainly the various branches of Baptists do not. The evangelicals do not. The Pentecostals, I don't think. I'm not sure about the Pentecostals. The answer is very simple, because first, baptism in the ancient church always included the children. I mentioned that, I think, this summer. We're talking about baptism from the pulpit. It says in the book of Acts, and the entire household. So when the parents came to faith, they brought their children with them and united their children to Christ. So historically, we know children were always baptized with their parents. And that's what I tell parents who don't come to church. I said, well, come to church. You get your life connected to Christ, and then bring your children with you, right? The other answer I would give, Charlie, to that question is, I am 48 years old, and I do not understand the fullness of God. If we're going to wait for full understanding, then we're all going to die unbaptized, because God is unknowable. And so it seems to me, I'm only speaking for myself now, it seems to be a pretty random number to say 12 years old, they're old enough to understand. Maybe 12's not. But understand what? Because we know they'll understand better at 15, so why not wait till 15? We understand we'll understand better at 45, so why not wait till 45? It seems to be a random calculation in that particular example. Yes?
Father, can we baptize during Lent, and why or why?
Yeah, so baptisms, that's a great question. When can we and when can we not baptize children? Okay, so baptisms should not take place on fasting days, okay, unless they have to. Meaning, and here's why. There's no prohibition to having a baptism during Lent. But the church knows that families want to have a party, and we don't party during Lent. And so I tell families, look, we really shouldn't be doing the baptism now, because you can't have dancing, and you can't have souflaikia, and you can't have this, and you can't have that. And we know families are going to want to have some kind of a reception. And so they either have to promise to have a Lenten reception, and most families would rather celebrate, and so they wait until after the Lenten season is over. But that's the reason why we don't, not that there's a prohibition. There are some days in the calendar year where baptisms are not allowed. You cannot do a baptism, for example, on the feasts of Christ. You can't do a baptism on Christmas Day. You can't do a baptism on Epiphany Day, things like that. But for the most part, baptisms are allowed. We just have to be careful of how we're celebrating after the fact, which is why we kind of lean people not in the fasting not in the fasting. There was a hand back here somewhere.
When we baptize, we also give the communion besides other sacraments. Do other religions do that, or do they all separate?
Right, so to clarify, when we do our baptism service for babies, there's three things happening. There's the sacrament of baptism, the sacrament of Chrismation, which we're going to talk separately about next week, and there's the sacrament of Holy Communion. So there's three sacraments in one service that we call the baptism service, okay? Now, in the Roman Catholic Church, baptism, it does not include confirmation, which we call Chrismation, or communion, just baptism. I don't know about the other churches. And in the Catholic Church, the reason is only the bishop can do the confirmation. And so in the ancient church, the bishop would go around and they'd all do their baptisms, and then they have a group confirmation, which is why the Catholic Church today has confirmation classes, and after confirmation they have their first communion, etc. But in the Orthodox tradition, we do it all together at once in one service. Keep me on time today, huh? 1 minute. Last question. Okay, so I'm going to challenge you all, since none of you actually remember your baptism, go looking for photographs, and if you're young enough, videos. So I don't know, John, maybe you have some black and whites of your baptism, but maybe some hand drawings, maybe some carvings in the rocks from when you were baptized. I don't know. Good thing Charlie came late today. It was your turn this week, right? All right, so next week we're going to talk about Chrismation, and we'll include it not only as part of baptism, but of course as the process of adult conversion when we talk about the sacrament of Chrismation.